Hello, everyone. I want to thank you for your participation and especially the track committee for the virtual welcome. Today, we're going to talk about aniconism, starting from a definition of the topic. In works on the visual cultures of different religious traditions, the notion of the aniconic comes up from time to time. Not only is the rejection of images of divine characters in certain historical periods of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but so are also some Hindu, Taoist, and other Eastern cults. Aniconism is also dressed in works on Greek and other ancient Mediterranean religions. This diversity of tradition is one reason that the concept of aniconic is attributed with different meanings and the scholarship of different religious fields. What is considered aniconic in one tradition is not the same as the aniconic in another. In addition, the notions of the icon and the iconic that the aniconic is supposed to negate tend to create further confusion. The first part will be a stance on the terminology to be used and how it is understood. The second part will be focused on the specific case of the altar that appears in onomastics of Near Eastern gods as a core of information on the cultic reality, which often fulfills what is classically called aniconism. This speech, although closely linked to the iconographic category, will focus on epigraphic material and the fundamental contribution of the onomastic analysis of data. This paper aims through a brief history of the term to examine the Near Eastern context of the Greek-Roman era and chooses a specific case, that of the altar, to reach the conclusion that the category of aniconism is flexible and ambiguous even in the same cultural and cultic context. We try to develop the idea that the aniconic form of the divine representation is in different cultures one of the possible forms of the divine, and that it intends, just like the anthropomorphic and theriomorphic representation, to express a particular aspect, a specific phase of divine power. The earliest incidence of a related word appears as part of anti-idolatrous arguments found in Clement of Alexandria's Christian apologetic text, Stromates. Here he coins the Greek divine as an iconiston, not representable as image, because it is essentially impossible to represent the divine visually. The word, therefore, is ancient, but it is not used in the scientific lexicon until the end of the 19th century. A look at modern use of the term takes us up to Mettinger in No Graven Images, an essential book of 1995, which offers a first detailed description of the meaning as part of his contribution to the debate over aniconism in Israelite religion. According to Mettinger, in aniconic cults, there is no iconic representation of the deity, serving as the dominant or central cultic symbol. There is where we are concerned with either an aniconic symbol or sacred emptiness. The first of these two types can be exemplified by standing stones and was named by Mettinger as material aniconism, whereas the second, which he named empty space aniconism, can be exemplified by the empty throne. A broader point of view and anthropological perspective is that of Alfred Gell. In Art and Agency, an anthropological theory of 1998, he suggested the definition of index of divine presence to describe a marker that indicates to the worshipper that a divine power is present at a particular site. Meanwhile, there are indexes which refer to other entities, such as gods, which are visible but which do not permit abductions as to the visual appearance of the entity, because they lack any visual recognition cues. There are many forms of representation, in other words, only one of which is the representation of visual form. Approximately, the aniconic image of the god in the form of a stone is an index of the god's spatio-temporal presence, but not his appearance. But in this case, the spatial location of the stone is not arbitrarily or conventionally associated with the spatial location of the god. The stone functions as a natural sign of the god's location, just as smoke is a natural sign of the spatial location of fire. I fully agree with this definition of Gell, but the question we are asking here is whether an iconism is present in many religions with many variations may also indicate a specific form under which a given community worships a god in addition to or instead of the function of divine presence marker. This question arises from the reading of an essay concerning the conception of the representation of Shiva in the Hindu religion. It is an essay by Michael Hector, Grasping the Formless in Stone, 2017, which traces the main forms in which the Hindu god is venerated. Shiva is primarily venerated in his form of Shivalinga, an aniconic cylindrical shaft rising from a rounded pedestal, but there are also anthropomorphic images that are venerated. From theological texts, Shiva is simultaneously differentiated and undifferentiated. He is differentiated, so accessible to the worshipper and active, and undifferentiated, so transcendent and unfathomable. This distinction is to some extent carried over to the visual supports of Shiva. The aniconic representation is undifferentiated, corresponding to Shiva in his highest Paramashiva aspect. The anthropomorphic image is differentiated, so corresponding to Shiva as the great Lord in his various mythological aspects as Densa, teacher, etc. Although I'm not an expert of Hindu religion, I wondered if we could ask some questions in a comparative sense starting from this element. So, is it possible to imagine also for the Near Eastern world a differentiated meaning of the aniconic representation from the anthropomorphic and or theriomorphic one? Is it possible to think that in front of different kinds of representations, each one specifies the god in some sense? And moreover, is it possible that this specification exists in the aniconic representation itself? Perhaps nor in a hierarchical sense of the power of the god, but in a qualifying way. So more essential for us today is the question of whether the ancient Near Eastern region was characterized in any general way by the avoidance of images or the worship of cult objects which were distinct from the anthropomorphic images typical of Greek-Roman antiquity. A prompt response is given by the many sources we can find in northern Syria, in an area halfway between Antioch on the Orontes of the Syrian Tetropolis and Beroea, ancient name of Aleppo. Here lies the limestone massif, famed for the dead cities of Syria. The massif embraces a series of modest limestone ranges with fertile interior valleys stretching northwards from near Apamea and rising up to the east of Orontes and the plain of Antioch to shade off eastwards into the steppe itself and the plains round Beroea. There are still standing remains of innumerable villages of the late Roman period up to the Islamic conquest of central importance in the history of monasticism from the 5th century AD. Unlike the churches so numerous and often well preserved, the temples of northern Syria have attracted very little attention. The list of temples given by George Chalenko in his essential work of 1953 in 3 volumes, Village antique de la Syrie du Nord, Le Massif du Belus à l'époque romaine, is probably not exhaustive, but there is in these mountains a group of sanctuaries that deserves in many ways much more attention. To analyze the aniconic phenomenon in this region, we have to concentrate on the cults tested by the sanctuaries, among those of the massif that are at high altitude. These temples are four in number and they are dedicated to the same divinity, Zeus. Finally, from the architectural point of view, they are very close to each other. The first temple is the temple of Zeus Madbacchus of Gebel Sheikh Barakat. After the temple of Zeus Turbarakos of Zrir and the temple of Zeus Bomas of Burg Bakira are arranged in triangle around the rich interior plain of Dana. The first, located farther apart, is the temple of Kalat Kalota, built on the east edge of the Jebel Shiman in the north of the Massif and dedicated to Zeus Samos. These cults will be at the center of our discussion regarding the Syrian aniconic cult in the Greek-Roman age, often adapted to Greek deities who possess in and out of Syria a figurative, anthropomorphic, or theriomorphic representation. We have many examples of this characteristic aniconism of Syrian cults, from the standard gods of Atra, Samia or Samia, to the Hierapolis triad, to all sorts of standing stones, Abadir, Masebot, Sikanatu, Betils, etc. Before moving to the cult of the altar, it is necessary to introduce the aniconic cult of the standing stones in ancient Near East. The geographical distribution includes Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. The sizes of these objects vary from 25 centimeter to 3 meter large. The basalt or limestone stone is generally local. They are found both indoors and outdoors in a sacred or domestic context. The central position they occupy in the sanctuary suggests that they serve as objects of worship and or rituals. They may be single or multiple and seem to prefer this second distribution in Lebanon, in Israel, and in the Jordan Valley. About the category of Betil, there are many sources coming from the north of Syria, which allow to identify this region as one of the most important irradiation places of this kind of aniconic cult. The etymology of Bytulus, this is an example on a coin. The etymology of Bytulus is unknown, maybe a loan word from Betel, so the house of the god, as a temple. But no Semitic language shows the use of this term to refer to cultural stones from the Middle East or elsewhere. The etymological manual makes drift Bytulos from bite, skin, hence skin tent or shelter. The grammarian Priscian of Caesarea presents Bytulos as the synonym of Abadir. This last term is attested in Latin as a theonym in two inscriptions from North Africa related to an altar in Meliana in Caesarean Mauritania. The Greek and Latin lexicographers often take up the idea that the Betil or the Abadir is the stone that Rhea made Chronoset in place of Zeus, which reinforces the idea that this type of monument is also conceived as a tangible manifestation of the divine presence. Wherever its gender or etymology, the meaning of the word is very clear. The Betil is an animated stone associated with the worship of a god and used by priests to perform oracular rites. The characteristic there is the ability to move, because animated lithoi empsychoi is referred by Philo of Byblos, which is also the oldest testimony of the term in Greek. Philo in the 2nd century AD explains that Baetulia were invented by the god Uranus when he managed to create lithoi empsychoi, meaning animated stone, which fell from the heavens and possessed magical power. So the Features described point to round or spherical, red or black meteorites. The term may occur in the lost work of Sotakos, from which we have a quote in Pliny in the 1st century AD in the Natural History. Ex isque nigre sint ac rotunde sacras esse, urbes perillas expugnari et classes, betulos vocari, que vero longe sint ceraunias. We do not know whether the term to describe sacred stone as fallen from the even and animated with divine power as an older Eastern tradition, or is in its precise meaning rather Hellenistic erudition. This kind of ritual object is attested for the north of the Syria by epigraphy and numismatic representations. The analysis of onomastic data is essential in the study of these sources. From Dura Europos, an altar of the 3rd century AD, inscribed on the front face with 8 brief lines in Greek, tells us something about the ancient Near East. To the ancestral god, Zeus Betulos of those by the Orontes, Aurelius Defiliano, soldier of the legend 4th Shetica Antoniniana, has offered this in fulfillment of a prayer. We are discussing an ancestral god linked to a region not well defined, more or less wide, near the river Orontes, which flows from Lebanon to Antioch. However, the divine appellation used, Zeus Betulus, remains unique in our evidence. It does not even seem clear whether Betulus is an adjective or a noun. In the latter case, Zeus the Betel may is the long-standing object of worship of a wider population. The external reference to this northern Syrian cult finds a good correspondence in the epigraphic evidence of the region, especially in the above-mentioned temples of the Jebel Shiman. A similar evidence of Betel cult comes from Kalat Kalota, situated at 570 meters of height. It dominates the eastern part of the Jebel Shiman and looks towards the plain of Aleppo. Two ruined Christian churches and the remains of other buildings show the occupation in the early Byzantine era. In the north wall around the early Byzantine churches, there is an inscription as a spolia dating back to the middle of the 2nd century AD, dedicated to the ancestral deities Samos and Symbetulus. The same gods are known in a second inscription dated 224 AD as a spolia in a building used as an oil mill in the nearby village of Kefr Nabo, 3 kilometers west from Kalat Kalota. This text is complete and appears a third deity, Seimo, kai Betulo, kai Leonti, Theois Patrois. Samos is associated with Zeus in other inscriptions of the place. For the other two deities, the Greek reading is less evident, but the Symbetulus seems to derive from the preposition syn plus betulus, to indicate perhaps a deity that shares the betel with the others, or simply a strengthening preposition. The representation, the most identifiable of such objects, though not rare in the Middle East, are mainly attested in numismatics of the cities of Roman Syria, and in a remarkable way, they are sometimes linked to the cults of the Greek oracular shrines. Among the expressions of an iconic cult of the limestone massif, in addition to those of the Kalota, we review the other 3 peaks of the Jebel Shiman already mentioned. On the first spur of the Jebel Barisha at its rear, a ruined temple is dedicated to Zeus Turbarakos. The appellation derives from 2 loan words of Semitic origin. We may suggest the roots Tur, mountain rock, and Barak, to bless. Also in this case, the divine appellation of Zeus seems to be part of the same cultural environment from which originated the onomastic sequences of the Kalota. Another phase of this cultic expression is represented by the specification of the cultic object. There is the altar. The other 2 peaks of the Jebel Shiman report the association of Zeus with the Greek and Semitic noun to mean the ritual object for sacrifices, so the altar. On another spur of the Jebel Barisha, overlooking both the plain of Antioch and the interior plain of Dana, there is the well preserved pagan temple at Gur Bakira. A Greek inscription on the lintel of the gate identifies the deity worshipped there and gives the date of construction. The Zeus Bamas, so Zeus the altar, greet attentive Apollonius and Apollophanes and Calvian, the sons of Marion, erected the gate from the Epoikion of Merthos, year 209, Gorpiaius. Bamas is a Greek noun meaning altar. It is not possible to foresee a translation other than this, in which Bamas acts as an apposition, so the second element identifies the first in another way. The impression that this type of syntagma gives is that the two names identify the divinity power, so the divine power, so Zeus, and the way in which it manifests itself, so the Bamas, and so how it is represented. Not far from this Zeus Bamas, we find a Semitic version in Greek characters. The last peak of the Jebel Shiman is the only real mountain in the limestone massif. The Jebel Sheikh Barakat, some 817 meters high and dominating the whole surrounding area. A long series of Greek inscriptions record the pretext of a cut and the construction of a sanctuary there in the imperial period. The wall of the sanctuary formed a square of about 68 meters on a partially artificial esplanade and lined with an inner portico. The 47 reported inscriptions, all in Greek, make it clear that the temple was constructed early, beginning about 18 AD and being completed in 140 AD. The deities worshipped were Zeus Mad Bacchus and Selamanes, the ancestral gods. The expression Mad Bacchus must mean the same as Zeus Bamas at Bakira, 17 kilometers away. Behind this word must lie the Aramaic one Madbak altar. Selamanes was indeed a truly ancestral divine name, attested in the second millennium BC, and also appears in a Sidonian inscription of Hellenistic period. To this evidence corresponds the same consideration made in the case of the cult of Zeus Bamas. It seems to me that the altar is here to mean a way in which the divine power of Zeus is carried out. We do not know whether it refers to a sacrificial stone or a carved altar, but following the distinction made earlier, we are faced with a ritual object that is itself ritualized when it becomes a mark of the divine presence in that given ritual context. Before leaving the north of Syria, we must look at the numismatic testimonies, which give us some clues on how to conceive this kind of representation. Some reverses of coins produced in Antioch on the Orontes record a cut of the altar deity depicting what, according to Richard Macaulay, the coins of Antioch, seems an altar with animal legs, perhaps of a lion. The nearby city of Antioch coins under old Roman emperors, but it also has an independent mint. At this period, Antioch fully expresses its cultural background of local character. The type and photo is a bronze coin of 68 AD under Nero, owned today by BNF and Paris. And it represents on the obverse a bust of Zeus and on the back an altar with garlands. So the altar represented has elements of support in the form of animal pole. It may be risky to suppose that it is the lion present in the North Syrian cult of the Kalota and also in the Heliopolitan iconography as an image of the solar deity. But we can easily assume that this pattern derives from the same multicultural and local heritage. So the only literary evidence which can be quoted for the concept of the altar as itself object of worship comes from the work of Porphyry of Tyre in the later century, De Abstinentia. The quote is en passant, is collecting examples of people who make human sacrifices, and among these, he quotes the Dumatenoi of Arabia. They are inhabitants of Dumata, city of the Arabian desert, also described by Stephanus of Byzantium. He quotes a historian named Glaucus, author of Arabian Antiquities, as Isers, unknown to others. The site is identified with the current Jove, not of caravan tracks, in the Nabatean area southwest of Damascus. In the second book, Porphyry writes the Dumatenoi of Arabia used to sacrifice a child every year and bury him under the altar which they used as a sacred image, xoanon. The word xoanon in Greek, often translated as sacred image, sacred statue in wood or stone, does not indicate a real image, as the term icon, but as the generic meaning of representation symbol. It is the same word with which Lucian defines the standards of Hierapolis, xoanon cruzeon, golden image, or the object there is dedicated on the calota to the three deities same as Symbetulos and Leon, to cruzun xoanon, the golden image. So this quote in Porphyry tells us that the worship of the altar can arise from its ritual function and not necessarily from the identification with the divine power. It is an image of worship because it is a mark of divine power and not divine power itself. The reference to the Dumatenoi of Arabia reminds us that the cult of the altar is present not only in the north of Syria, but has some attestations also in the south, in the Nabatean kingdom. In general, the representation and worship of deities in the form of idol blocks is perhaps the most characteristic feature of Nabatea's religious practices. The Nabateans used two main types of stelae, the betel, meaning the representation of deity, and the nefesh, a memorial mark for the dead. So the centrality and the large diffusion of the cut of standing stones does not allow us to fulfill a wide search in this sense. In this case, the analysis will focus mainly on the aniconic aspects of the Nabatean religion related exclusively with the cult of the god Dushara and its links with the altar as a ritual object itself. We may start from the Byzantine lexicon Suda of the 10th century AD. Here we read under the entry Theuseres, a corruption maybe of Duseres, the Greek form of Dushara. Theusares, there is the god Ares at Petra in Arabia. The god Ares is worshipped by them, for they venerate him above all others. The image, the agalma, is a black stone lithos melas, rectangular and unshaped, measuring 4 feet in height by 2 feet in wide. It is set on a base, worked in gold. To this they burn incense, and against it they pour the blood for the sacrificial animals. And there is their form of libation. The whole building abounds in gold and many dedications. It is commonly held that the entry describes the Gothic image of Dushara at Petra, possibly in the Khazar bint. At the rear of the central adjuton is a recess of approximately the same size as the Gothic image described in the Suda, which may indicate the place of that image. Molded stucco fragments from the temple coated with a gold leaf seem to illustrate the above passage. Although it is called a black stone, it seems not to have been a meteorite because of its clear proportions. The stone seems to be worked by a mason, therefore unshaped, means non-figural or aniconic. Nabatean aniconism does not generally avoid images, but it does avoid the anthropomorphic form of images. While all betas combine dedication, veneration, and divine presence, this type could primarily point to the sacrificial veneration of the Gothic image. According to the Suda, the Nabateans burned incense and poured blood on the sacred stone. We know that only the blood of animals was offered to the deity. About this use in Metzinger, no graven images, we read, the sacrificial method, par préférence, is blood. Blood rites are central to Arabian cults, pre-Islamic and later, and to Nabatean ritual. Blood rites are also known among the Phoenicians. As for Ugarites, blood does not seem to be mentioned in the ritual text, but the well-known West Semitic root diba connected with slaughter is present in words for sacrifice and altar. Possibly this custom is reflected in epithet used for Dusharet Bosra Ara. According to Starkey and Wenning, the term means the extraordinarily anointed one. Therefore, it is useful to focus on the cult of Dushara in Syria and Arabia to have a wider vision. According to Healy, the Nabateans created their own god named Dushara in a traditional way with an epithet. Du al Sharat would mean the one of the Sharat mountain. The ancient North Arabian Du element supports the suggestion that the name points to people from North Arabian origin. Therefore, it makes little sense to ask which known deity is behind the epithet. If the reading, the one of the Sharat mountain, is correct, and this is a widely held view, then Dushara is marked as a mountain god, and in ancient Near Eastern tradition as a storm god by this name. So the mountains and rocks were of such great importance and veneration of Dushara at Petra. One must recall the battles, the rock cut niches, and the motab. So an interpretation of Dushara often leads to Zeus as the supreme god, and the Near East very often a mountain god, as we have seen for the north of Syria. Zeus is represented in several Nabatean reliefs from Petra. None of these are chaotic representation for veneration, nor are they pure decoration, but part of programs which could serve to illustrate the power and blessing of the local gods. In his appearance as a mountain deity, Dushara is a local god who, in iconography and onomastics, respects, in some cases, the prototype of Zeus. According to Wenning, although there was no problem depicting Dushara in the type of Zeus, we do not find this in the official monumental or Gothic buildings. I doubt that Zeus has been venerated in Petra in the Nabatean period as a Nabatean deity. This consideration is valuable also for the onomastic aspect. It is not difficult to imagine that the name of Zeus and its most common titles were used as an alternative reading, a Greek reading maybe, their local deity could assume in the same way of a coin's reverse with a prototype of Zeus seated or a birded face. This concept is summed up in the expression of Maurice Sartre about the Interpretatio Greca. L'habitude de donner un nom grec aux dieux étrangers n'est pas destinée à imposer aux indigènes une vue grecque de leurs dieux, mais permet au contraire aux Grecs de reconnaître les leurs sous l'apparence des dieux locaux. Whatever is association with the Greek god, Dushara takes on different aspects of different deities. So, returning to the testimony of the Suda, it is possible to imagine that this type of practice is an aspect of Dushara represented by its former Ara, the god Batil, venerated in Bosra. The gods of Bosra are identified both because they are mentioned in the inscriptions of the city and because they are qualified as god goddess of Bosra and inscriptions from other sites of Nabatea. The evidence is found over a wide area, from the Oran to Igra, both before and after the Roman annexation. The wide distribution argues for this not being a purely local phenomenon. A Egra inscription dated 3940 AD does not name Dushara, but is clearly in the background Ara, who is in Bosra, god of Rabel, while an inscription from Imtan and Oran, dated 9380, reads, to Dushara Ara, god of our Lord, who is in Bosra. South of Bosra, in the famous village of al Jimal, there is another attestation, this time in Greek, on a bilingual altar of Dushara Ara, with the first transcription in Greek of the word. The Greek form is Mazekos, son of Awedanos, for Dushara Ara. The Nabatean form is altar made by Maseko, son of Aweda, for Dushara. The dedication is on an altar. On the Greek side of the dedication does not appear the noun bomos, which instead is present in the incipit of the Nabatean text, just as in the Nabatean text, the name of A'ara is missing. I find no obstacle to the hypothesis that the equivalent of the common name for altar is translated with a socially shared reference to the local deity linked to the ritual sphere. There is A'ara. In this sense, it seems to me that among the many proposals on the origin of the term, that of Texidor finds new light. According to him, the usual change of Arabic gain into Aramaic ain makes likely the hypothesis that A'ara comes from an Arabic root, agra, with the meaning of dying or anointing. Indeed, Al-Gariyu is the name of a stone idol worshipped by pagan Arabs that was stained or dyed by the blood of sacrificed animals. Etymologically, the name A'ara would mean an altar or idol dyed with the blood of the victims offered upon it. The nature of noun let us assume a translation such the dyed. This association may have many meanings. The transfer of the cult of Dushara together with the move of the capital from Petra to Bosra under the king Rabel II is a valid reason for the birth of this association of the traditional god of the Nabateans with the local god of Bosra, A'ara. Here is the meeting point in a religious syncretism of two deities under the reign of Rabel II, who aimed to make Dushara, the national Nabatean god, his own god and the god of his city. On the other side, the appropriation means the creation of a new aspect more familiar to an imported deity. We do not know whether this association with a god connoted by the ritual aspect of the cult has led to changes of Nabatean rituals in honor of Dushara, or at least there are no traces except if we give credibility to the text of Porphyry. But it seems to me that the association of these two aniconic cults can say more than the simple absence of figurative image or marker of the divine presence. I think we can say that this type of aniconism is qualifying, so it emphasizes a specific aspect of the cult, which in this case is the ritual one. Coming back to the start, the key point of this paper is that the category of aniconism is more flexible and ambiguous than it seems. Not representing an anthropomorphic or theriomorphic image does not mean representing an image indistinct, necessarily atupatos, to follow the words of the Suda. We should perhaps consider that a qualifying aniconism exists, able to present in the foreground to stress a specific aspect of the divine power there is described in each context, without necessarily using animal and or human attributes. The association of the aniconic cults of Syria with the altar seems to me to go in this direction. The ritual object gives information about the aniconic cult, not identifying itself with the divine power, but specifying and qualifying its cult. So thank you for the attention.